Welcome back. So, we got the brand new 3 helps banner, and I did cover a bit of the fodder potential when it came to Rearmed Lif yesterday, but I figured I'd just continue what I've been doing with a lot of the recent banners and just doing a brief overview of all the new fodder and giving a general idea of what units you want to put it on, as well as the types of supports you may want to run with them on the off chance that you do put it on specific units. As such, I'll be going over the brand new Bulwark skill that we got on male Shez, the new tempo skill that we got on Monica, the brand new damage reduction skill that we got on Hilda, and the brand new clash skill that we got on Rearmed Lif. If you did click on this video looking for any sort of guidance when it came to the sword inheritance options, I'll link my previous video in the description as I go over it there, and because I went over it in depth over there, I feel like it's not really worth retrekking old ground in this video, because we're going over basically passives and stuff. But I will bring mention of it in due time because there is something worth mentioning there. But regardless, we may as well just get started with male Shez, who came with Speed Defense Bulwark, which isn't a new skill, but it's basically a variant of what we got previously with Asker. It debuffs the foe's speed and defense by 4 points during combat. It has the Mega Obstruct effect that you found on the likes of Gatekeeper, and it heals you for 7 HP after combat. So normally when it comes to any sort of Bulwark skill, these are definitely enemy phase oriented, because you're really not going to be able to take advantage of movement limitations with Bulwark if you were to enter some sort of player phase role. Of course, you could always enter the player phase and then position allies right behind, but generally this is a lot more consistent when it comes to enemy phase roles. However, the difference between this one and the attack defense variant is that this one is definitely more keen on units that have speed or workable speed to use this skill. So if you were to put this on any sort of slow unit with a guaranteed follow-up, then it's not going to be worth it in that regard, and you would much rather run attack defense Bulwark. But also because it does come at the cost of a competitive B slot, you will want specific units that can take advantage of other skills. So for example, in the speed defense Bulwark candidates, one of the most important aspects you can easily have when it comes to this is damage reduction. So if you were to run any sort of Vital Astra user with attack speed unity and a slaying effect with Times Pulse and Mystic Boost Seal, they can shrug off a good amount of damage and heal back a good amount of it after combat, which is going to be really, really important. Vital Astra only gives damage reduction if the special is ready at the start of combat. So unlike Godlike Reflexes, which can be charged in combat, it's going to be a bit more inconsistent, depending on who you use it on, of course. But if you were to use it on any sort of unit with a slaying effect, and then maybe some sort of ability to loop their special, like Ascended Marina, who comes with Vital Astra, or you could just bank on the idea that maybe they won't one-shot with Vital Astra, then it would work out relatively well. Of course, Godlike Reflexes, while being a lot higher in cooldown, is a lot more consistent when it comes to its damage reduction properties, and it's a bit better because it doesn't get affected by the likes of damage reduction nullification effects. However, there's like one unit that pierces through, so it doesn't really matter as much in that regard compared to Vital Astra, but in terms of just getting consistent damage reduction with sustainability in mind, Godlike Reflexes is definitely going to be a lot better. And you can still keep the Mystic Boost Seal, so that way you're just keeping up a good amount of sustain. In my opinion, Mystic Boost Seal is going to be one of the best options when it comes to pairing with other skills like Bulwark, because you just end up healing a good amount after combat. Of course, you don't necessarily need a special for damage reduction if they have damage reduction built into their weapon. So units like Hilda, for example, who have flat damage reduction on their first hit, can actually just rely on whatever special they want. In that regard, it's not really going to be as bad, but you could also swap it out for a healing special, and then instead of running Mystic Boost, you can run something that continuously boosts up attack and speed, so you can avoid more natural doubles. But given that it is Hilda, you're probably not going to struggle on that front. You could also give this Bulwark skill to any sort of unit with a null follow-up effect, because the other thing compared to units that have damage reduction, unless they're running null follow-up support, which I'll get into in a bit, they're going to be doubled anyway. So in some aspect, if you are able to just take one attack instead of one attack and then a guaranteed follow-up attack after that point, then you're essentially just taking less damage in general. And then you can always just heal it back up with the likes of Bulwark and Mystic Boost Seal. And that really shouldn't be a problem. Of course, you could also run Piercing Tribute for specific Lance Infantry, as that does shut down guaranteed follow-up attacks. And if you do have more speed over the foe anyway, then they're only going to be able to hit you once. However, it doesn't guarantee your own doubles. So if you are hit by any sort of impact or wary effect, then it isn't going to work, but you could still maintain the same idea as you would with any sort of no follow-up unit. But you could also go down another route with units that have guaranteed follow-ups in their weapon. So if you were to run any sort of unit with Seahorse Axe or Coral Saber, for example, even if they could potentially get doubled by any sort of guaranteed follow-up, they're at least securing their own doubles comparatively. So in that regard, there are trade-offs. Whether or not you want to prevent the foe's guaranteed follow-ups or you want to secure your own, there is merits to each. But regardless of what set you use and what unit you use it on, most of them are going to need some sort of external support, whether that's from the likes of null follow-up from a Lilith, or maybe infantry null follow or infantry speed tactic. You can also run damage reduction support from Flane or Elamine if you only have no follow-up and no damage reduction properties. And if you are that niche case where you don't need either of those, you could just continue to stack up stats, because one of the benefits to Bulwark is that you could just position units right behind the unit in question, and then you can stack stats without any sort of risk of them getting sniped. Which is why these three in particular are really, really good supports. But if you can find units that can replicate a similar niche, then they're also just as good. And in terms of just inheriting this skill, one of the benefits to Shez in particular with his skill inheritance is that you can actually grab attack speed of 4 and Bulwark at the same time if you have a Shamir or the recently released Holst, who isn't out today, but he should be coming out within a day or two. Even with that being the case, if you just grab attack speed 03 from any one of these two, who are easily available in the Grails, then you could grab Bulwark and attack speed 04, which I highly, highly recommend. But if you are looking to just use Bulwark in general, consider these options. Next we have Monica, who came with attack speed ideal 4, which isn't new, but she came with speed res tempo, which is a new take on the tempo skills. It took a while for us to get a second tempo, and the last one we did get was from Legendary Deirdre. Before then, it was Young Mia who had it back in April or March, whichever month it was. So it seems like now they're starting to pump out these skills a lot more. Regardless, it is a really, really nice skill if you are more player phase centric, because the problem with tempos, in my opinion right now, is that unless you're really using it for player phase purposes, it's only going to act as a debuff in most cases for the enemy phase. But given that a lot of mages aren't necessarily built for the enemy phase, especially the infantry ones, I don't think this is necessarily as big of a problem here. But there are also just quite a lot of units that can use this skill too. So if you just wanted to put it on any sort of unit with slaying, you can do that. Brave Lysithea recently got a refund, and it did add the slaying effect to it. And it also gave her accelerated cooldown per hit, which is really, really convenient. So with the likes of Speed Res Tempo, she could always get a 2 cooldown special off every second hit, making her one of the harder hitting mages in the game, which is really, really nice. You could also give it to Aetherraid's Defense Specialist, so units that really function on Aetherraid's defense, for example, like Tyne or Tine, whatever, however you pronounce it basically. The reason this is a bit more important is because if you were to use her on a Catria Ball, for example, which I'll also get into in a bit with the supports, then you could bypass stuff like instant hardy fighter units, and then you could trigger a special on the second hit with tempo, which is really, really convenient. And then, of course, you could also give it to units with guaranteed follow-ups if the goal is to just bypass any sort of wary or impact effect. I don't believe there are that many tomes with guaranteed follow-ups and with a good amount of speed to boot, so units like Bakaya may be one of those few exceptions. Even so, if you were to put it on someone like her, for example, and then initiate combat against a unit with an impact effect, then you could always just outspeed them and then trigger a special afterward, which is really, really convenient. Of course, you could also put it on units with Desperation. We don't have a Desperation seal, and Desperation does take up the B slot, but if there are specific units that have a Desperation effect or some sort of Desperation support going for them, then they can easily use Speed Res Tempo, and they can also mimic the likes of Lysithea because they'll be able to trigger a 2 cooldown special relatively quick, which is really, really nice. And Forseti in particular is really, really standout in that regard. You could also give it to some niche tome users, such as Brave Marianne, who could actually use this relatively well. If the goal is just to get Requiem Dance off, you could always just do this with regular Flashing Blade and Times Pulse if she does double and outspeed. But with Speed Res Tempo, it does secure it quite well. For the most part, it's not really going to be affecting way too much. And then outside of that, you have your niche dragon cases. This does work with dragons, but the problem right now is that there aren't really any player phase dragons. But for units like Adrift Corrin, or I should say both Adrift Corrins, it can work in their favor because they have accelerated cooldown per attack in their weapon. So if the goal is to secure specials in general, they can make it work. And they have enough speed to the point where they could also initiate combat in the player phase, but you do have to keep in mind that if they aren't within 2 spaces of an ally in the enemy phase, then they lose out on most of their effects. In terms of support, I find that Bride Catria and any sort of no follow-up support is going to be the best bet for them. Not only because of the fact that they are giving up any sort of ability to double. In most cases, of course, you could always run it on Micaiah and she has her guaranteed follow-up, but in other scenarios, they are giving up their ability to double. So having any sort of no follow-up effect means that they can double through any sort of effects that may prevent them from doubling otherwise, which is really convenient. But as I mentioned earlier during the Tyne or TNA segment, you'll just have to tell me in the comments how it's pronounced. I really do not know. The idea here is that you would just pair it with any sort of fast mage on Aether 8's defense, and then just have them trigger a special on every second hit, so that way they can bypass stuff like Hardy Fighter armors and all that jazz. So in terms of just raw damage output, Bridal Catria would work remarkably well with units that are running speed rest tempo. But also it's worth noting that she can also run infantry speed tactic, so she can pretty much do everything in one, which is really, really convenient. And then similarly to the likes of male Shez, you can actually grab attack speed ideal 4 and speed rest tempo at the same time, because funnily enough, Holst also has attack speed ideal, so you could either grab it from him, or you could promote a Muriel and grab attack speed ideal from there. And if I remember correctly, both of them do need to be 5-star to get attack speed ideal 3. So I guess it really doesn't matter. I would pretty much just choose Muriel in that regard because I would not waste Holst merges, especially since he has a PRF and he can be relatively competitive. Also, if you were to go for future copies of attack speed Oath, then it could get expensive down the road. And yeah, I hope that if you are looking to use speed rest tempo in any facet, then consider these builds, units, you name it. Next we have Ascended Hilda, who has a brand new damage reduction skill, which is basically just half tempo with damage reduction, which is really, really, really good. So outside of just cutting down damage taken, they're basically going to be able to guarantee their own specials, which is really awesome. And it does work in both phases because there isn't any sort of phase condition, which is really nice. But because it's just damage reduction with tempo, it's going to be relatively simple for the most part because we already have similar types of skills. The only difference being now is that this just grants tempo, so they have more to work with. In terms of just notable candidates, any sort of unit with no follow-up in their weapon is going to work wonders with this because you're basically getting the God Sword combo of damage reduction, no follow-up, all that jazz. And then with tempo, even if they can't run Vital Astra for the damage reduction properties, they can still hit back really, really hard with the damage in tow. And it does actually work against stuff like Fallen Edelgard if you are still struggling against her. I can't imagine a lot of people are these days, but it is worth keeping note because you can still trigger a special against her, which is really convenient. You could also put this on any sort of general player phase unit as they'll be able to soak any sort of damage taken, and then trigger a special relatively quick, especially when paired with the likes of Heavy Blade or Flashing Blade, and then even potentially heal back with the likes of Search Barrel if you are running that. Regardless, it does work in the player phase because, again, tempo with damage reduction, really, really convenient. But you could also give it to any sort of Gale Force unit because, again, the tempo effect makes it so they can trigger Gale Force way more consistently. And I believe the only thing that actually cancels out the Flashing Blade is another foe's tempo effect, but I don't believe that's going to really come up too often. So anything with Gale Force is also a really good option. But that's really it in terms of like velocity candidates. If any unit you want to give this to meets any of these criteria, then it's probably going to be fine. But there really aren't many other options because this is also infantry, sword, lance, and axe locked, because it is also a damage reduction skill. However, in terms of support, there also aren't that many options. You could just continue to run any sort of no follow-up support, whether that's from Brave Crom, Ascended Celica, you name it. But you could also use this in a Gale Force composition with Wings of Mercy support. So if you can set up the Wings of Mercy beacon with the unit you're using, whether that's with Double Fury, falling into 50% range naturally, then you can have other units with Wings of Mercy teleport in and then Gale Force off that. But outside of that, there really aren't that many notable support options. However, unlike Male Shez and Monica, you can only get velocity and joint drive speed. As of the time of this video, there isn't any readily available attack speed solo 3 fodder in the normal 3 and 4-star pool. So at best, you can only get joint drive speed and velocity from the likes of Tail 2's fodder, because Tail 2 has drive speed too. However, we did get a Spring Fur manual, I think several months ago, so if you somehow have that, I think I still have mine, but if you do have it, you can always grab attack speed solo 3 from her, and then grab attack speed solo 4 and velocity from there. But until we get more readily available attack speed solo 3 fodder, the only thing you can really do right now is joint drive speed, which is a bit unfortunate, but to be fair, all of it's really premium anyway, and there are a lot of alternatives, so I really wouldn't worry about it too much. But yeah, if you are looking to give velocity to any sort of unit, I highly recommend just taking the builds and unit types into consideration, because that will help you much more in the long term. And then finally, we have Rearmed Lif, who has a lot of fodder actually. He has his PRF, which can be granted to any sort of sword unit. His attack defense clash 4, which is the one we'll mainly be going over, and an attack defense menace, which isn't anything new. I said this at the beginning of the video, but I did already cover usages for his weapon in particular. So if you are here just to look for the weapon usage in particular, I'm not really going to be covering that here. So I would recommend just going to the video I have linked in the description, because that will go over in much greater detail. But regardless, we're mainly just going to be covering attack defense clash, because attack defense clash is still a relatively new skill that could also use some explaining to those who aren't really too familiar with it, because right now we only have attack speed clash on Brave Seliph. The way attack defense clash works, or any clash in general, is just based on how far a unit moves. So if you were to run up 2 spaces and initiate combat, you get whatever static amount plus the amount of tiles moved. So that'll add up to a fair degree, but it also works in the enemy phase if the foe initiates combat on you and they move. But it also has a secondary effect based on how many tiles you move. And if you move more than 1 tile, then you also get penalty neutralization to your attack and defense, or whatever respective stats are for the clash. So in that regard, there is a lot of things you can do with Clash. So one of the more obvious things you can do with Clash is just give it to any sort of high movement unit. It is 1 range locked, and it can't be used on armors. So your best bet is really just to put it on a cavalry unit. So you can give it to someone like Bertram with Coral Saber and a Flow. So that way they could just hit really hard and tank really, really easily, physically at least. Not really through the res, but until we get maybe something like Defense Res Clash, then maybe it'll happen. But yeah, just give it to any sort of high movement unit with good attack and good defense, and even like any sort of way to double, and they'll do really well with it. You could also give it to any sort of enemy phase tank like Altena, as foes are just going to be running up and attacking her. More often than not, I can't imagine her not at least getting penalty neutralization all the time. The only way I don't see it happening is if you just bait out an armor, which you can still do, but they're not really going to be functioning that well in the player phase, because most of them nowadays are built for the enemy phase. So in that regard, enemy phase tanking with Clash is a really, really good idea. You could also use it with units that have warp effects, as it doesn't require actual movement as long as you move specific tiles, which is really, really convenient. So if you were to give this to maybe a Deke, for example, I just put Deke here because he has a pretty good stat line. He initiates combat, he gets the Clash effect, even with the penalty neutralization, and you're basically just stacking up a bunch of stats like crazy, and he could get Luna off on the second hit, assuming the foe can counter back. And then with the likes of Close Call, he can run back a bit, so that way he can get more out of Clash in the enemy phase, if he has to act as an enemy phase unit. Of course, you could also use this for any sort of Heavy Blade check with Gale Force, because Flyers and Cavs are locked to Heavy Blade at the moment, so having any sort of attack boost will always be beneficial in that regard. And because Attack Defense Clash does have penalty neutralization built into it, you can actually make Heavy Blade checks a lot easier, especially if you are debuffed or panicked in your attack stat. And then with Flyers in particular, they can run Reigns, which is really convenient because they can debuff the foe's attack for even more. And then outside of that, you could just use this for any sort of general hit and run unit, as being able to run away after combat is going to be really, really convenient, since you can still get the attack defense clash effects if the foe were to go and initiate combat on you in the enemy phase. I don't think Brave Erica may be the best example, but she was like one of the more notable ones that came to mind because she has Kanto 2 built into her weapon, or I think it was Moonlight Bengal, but regardless, any sort of unit that can hit and run will probably do well with it. So you could also use it with the likes of Florid Cane or Trace or whatever the case may be. Hit and run units will use it well. And in terms of support options, anything that can help you take advantage of the tile requirement is going to help you out dramatically in the support department. So units like Astrid or Annette that can grant extra movement on the rally is going to do wonders because it grants extra movement to basically a majority of units, which is really, really nice. You could also use units with Pathfinder effects like Knot, Dagger, New Year Dagger, whatever the case may be, and you'll be able to gain more distance as a result, which is really, really convenient. And outside of that, you could also use other units with warp effects, like Ash, as it does work with warp effects. You don't have to have actual movement. As long as you are moving tiles and you're moving a good amount of them, it will count towards Clash, which is really, really nice. And outside of that, I wanted to talk about the fodder for a bit, because right now there isn't any readily available Attack Defense Clash 3, which, I mean, makes sense because it's a brand new skill, we just got it. But because of that, you can only get Attack Defense Clash. As such, I figured it'd be worth talking about the Weapon and Menace, because those are two things that you could get at once. So if you were to use any sort of unit with Threat and Attack Defense 2, you could then grab a Menace, And then you could grab his PRF, which is really, really nice. However, if you don't want to spend grails for it, which very understandably so, then you could always just go with an Olivia or a Laszlo and grab Silver Sword, and then you could grab Threat Defense from a parry, and then you could just grab everything at once. So in that regard, if you are looking to grab the Sword and Menace, then consider these options. However, if you are looking just to get Clash, then there really isn't anything you can do to get anything else at the moment. However, if you are looking to take any of these skills, mainly Clash, I would highly, highly consider taking a good look at the builds again, or if you already have them memorized, just take them into consideration or specific units, because those are the types of units that will probably benefit from it the most. Even though Attack Defense Clash isn't exactly like the most coveted combination, it's still a good combination. And outside of that, there really isn't much else in terms of new fodder. Everything else is either demo or readily available or something we've already seen, so there really isn't much else to say. If you are pulling for any of these units in particular, I'm actually curious on which ones and who you're going to give it to. I'm hopeful that these builds and this guide will help you in that decision process. But if you are looking to give it to favorites, then go nuts. I'm not going to discourage you any sort of way. That's really about it when it comes to the video. So I may as well just call it here. If you want to see more videos like this, make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, I'll see you later.